Welcome to the EMT Pro podcast, where we deliver relevant content from the field and the classroom each week. Episodes of this podcast can get you 1 full hour of CE through our partner, emt-ce.com, so head over there for more information. I'm your host, Steve Williams, and with me today is solo Dan.
Just me.
Just you.
No Holly.
No Holly today. She's out gallivanting, getting her nurse practitioner
Some
doctorate.
education stuff, I guess.
Jeez, she's so smart. We miss her.
Yeah.
It feels really weird in here.
I know. Just put up with us today.
Yeah. So, great thing is, though, we got the bad news out of the way. The good news is we got a really fun guest, just a very interesting topic for today's podcast. We have a special guest, Eric Jaeger. Eric is a practicing paramedic as well as an attorney, and he's going to be discussing some of the legal ramifications of chemical sedation, and we'll be dissecting components of these types of calls, especially one that's really, kind of at the front of everyone's minds the last few years is the call with Elijah McClain and the subsequent incarceration of the paramedics who were involved on that call. And I'm just very interested to get a professional's legal opinion on that and kind of hear.
Yeah, that one hit hard.
Mm-hmm. That one sucked.
Yeah.
I didn't like seeing the body cam footage of that.
No.
I didn't like hearing a lot of the things that were said on that call.
It's very disturbing. And we've all been there. That's the problem. At least I know I have,
Mm-hmm.
So just been lucky. And hopefully Eric can guide us through a little cleaner way to do it.
Yeah. So let's get him on the phone and we'll get rolling.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, we have him on the line. Eric, are you there?
I am here.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to chat about everything we've got in the queue with you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys. I think this is an important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you do us a favor? Can you give us a bit about your background, what you've been doing in the EMS space, and I guess it would also be good to know how you became involved with some of the, higher profile cases involving chemical sedation before we start dissecting any components of those types of calls.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a somewhat unusual background for a paramedic and EMS educator. I actually went to MIT undergrad for computer science.
Oh.
And then I went on to law school. And I was a lawyer for about 10 years working in Boston. And I ended up, through a variety of mechanisms, switching gears and focusing instead on EMS and ultimately on EMS education. And for about the last 10 years, I've worked as a RSI Paramedic at Exeter Hospital in Exeter, New Hampshire. It's a small community hospital, but we run a paramedic intercept service out of there that provides support to surrounding communities. The way I got involved with issues related to managing agitated patients and death in custody and chemical sedation, it's the same way a lot of us, I think, began to pay more attention to this. George Floyd's death several years ago, and then Elijah McClain's death in Aurora, Colorado, where EMS providers were directly involved in providing care, and there were some tragic outcomes like Elijah McClain's death. It began to get me focused on what's going on here. Are there things that I need to do differently, both as a provider and as an educator for other paramedics, and as someone who writes protocols? Because the other thing I do is I've been writing protocols as part of the state of New Hampshire system for about 20 years. Are there things we need to do differently from a leadership protocol and training perspective to enhance safety when we're managing severely agitated patients? And the conclusion I came to, along with others working in this field, is absolutely we need to both better understand the pathophysiology of what's causing these deaths, and then think about how to reframe our approach so that we and I never like saying that we can make it safe, because when you encounter a severely agitated patient, it's inherently dangerous. But how can we enhance the safety of that interaction, both for the patient and reduce the risk of liability for the providers involved?
Yeah. You had mentioned RSI Paramedic, and I'm wondering if you could help us learn a little bit more about that, because I'm guessing in the state of New Hampshire, it might be a little different, where other states, everybody that's a paramedic can RSI or can't RSI, but it sounds like that's a different certification or checkoff, or how does that work?
Yeah, exactly. Here in New Hampshire, at least, most paramedics cannot perform rapid sequence intubation. They can do the traditional cardiac arrest intubation. We have a high level of certification for RSI paramedics, where we put them through additional training, additional certification, and recertification requirements to ensure that they are capable of performing RSI. I also, as an EMS educator, am an RSI educator. So the team at Exeter Hospital, I was responsible for doing the training around rapid sequence intubation. And I work with other agencies here in New Hampshire that want to get their folks certified. And I think it's relevant to our conversation because I think many of the things that we do in RSI to try and enhance safety, recognizing that while it's potentially a life-saving procedure, it creates a significant amount of risk along the way, are applicable in the chemical sedation context, which I think we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
What does that training look like for the additional certification?
You're required, before you can even consider, you're required to have a certain number of live intubations, and then it's usually about 16 to 24 hours of additional training that involve both classroom didactic training and quite a few simulations. As you may or may not know, rapid sequence intubation is very different than cardiac arrest intubation. And it really does take some time to sort of reorient providers' thinking to understand that while when I hop in the back and I've been called to assist with intubation, it's an emergent airway situation by definition. If we don't intubate this individual, there's a high risk they're going to die. And yet I don't immediately jump in with, pushing rocuronium and throwing a blade into the patient's mouth.
Right.
I do a series of things to set up to make sure we can do that safely. So we find in training paramedics, that's a different sequence than they're used to when they approach intubation. And so we do that training, that 16 to 24 hours worth of training, classroom, simulations, and then mentoring. They have to be mentored in the field, working under other RSI paramedics so that they can get that hands-on experience.
Wow, that's impressive.
That sounds actually the way it should be done,
It's
maybe.
exactly the way it should be done.
Yeah.
Gosh. So every paramedic in New Hampshire can intubate for cardiac arrest. Is that true?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And then RSI is an extra chunk of training. Gotcha.
Extra chunk of training for those patients that are still alive and yet very clearly require an emergent airway.
Yeah, taking over their airway. Gotcha. Awesome. Well, I think, as we approach this topic of chemical sedation with you, one thing that I think is important in the material that you've brought up before we get to chemical sedation, there is almost always some level of physical restraint involved in that. And I was wondering if you could walk us through some of the thoughts you have on physical restraint before we get to, chemical sedation, chemical restraint, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. In fact, probably the most important take-home point for folks listening is that we now understand that prone restraint for any extended period of time is inherently dangerous. How does this come up? So we might be called by 911 for a patient suffering a psychiatric emergency who is so severely agitated that we need to gain control of the situation. And as part of gaining control, we might take that individual into the prone position, at least briefly, to gain control. The recognition we have today is that keeping them in that prone position for more than a minute or two creates a risk of death because of the airway and ventilation compromise it represents. The other way we might come at this situation is we are often called to a scene when the police are trying to deal with a severely agitated individual, either someone having a medical emergency or, for example, a suspect who's under arrest. And our role in those situations should be to recognize that if the police are holding the individual prone, that we need to intervene in a professional way to say to them, hey, we got to get him up so we can make sure he can breathe adequately. This all arose, our focus on this topic arose out of a hard look at some of the in-custody deaths that have occurred over the last decade or more. We used to focus a lot on this concept of excited delirium, especially in the context of people who were using stimulant drugs, meth, cocaine, PCP. And the assumption was that they died from this mysterious thing that we called excited delirium. It turns out that excited delirium was based on flawed science. And we're in the process of pulling it back out of training and protocols. But if you step back from excited delirium, the question becomes, so what's causing these people to die if it's not excited delirium? It turns out it's a lot simpler than that. If someone is held prone on the ground and they're unable to adequately breathe, which means they can't adequately oxygenate and ventilate, they can either become so hypoxic or more likely so acidotic that they eventually fall off a cliff and die. The acidosis causes, for example, dysrhythmias or can cause complete cardiac standstill. Hypoxia can cause many of the same effects. And chemical sedation, and I know we haven't gotten to this part yet, but chemical sedation can mix toxically with that if you're not aware of the risks associated with using chemical sedation for someone who's been restrained. So the physical piece is just the recognition that, and it shouldn't really be a surprise, right? Our patients need to breathe adequately, and if they can't breathe adequately, they're at risk of significant morbidity and potentially mortality, death.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm just thinking back all the times where I get caught up in the police's emotions, and they're saying, "Oh, you need to restrain this guy, chemically restrain, get some drugs." And I go, yeah, let's do that. And I look back at how many times I did that and how lucky I was to not have something bad happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of a number of times where the same thing was. We've had patients where we're called to a scene, and I feel like I've seen it on both ends, though. I've had some where the police are way too,
hands off.
No, well, they're way too involved on one end, and they're trying to ramp everybody else up to their level. And then I've had other incredible interactions where the police are so professional.
Oh yeah,
they game plan before they put hands on. It's two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But I'm sure they would say the same thing. Oh man, how many times have I done that? Did it the wrong way and got lucky.
Right.
But that's where my brain's going, at least.
So I think there are a couple of key points in what both of you just said. Number one, just as we're having these conversations in EMS, on the law enforcement side, the folks who do training there and who look at the risk of liability for police officers are looking at the same issues. And I actually see law enforcement sort of standards, best practices, and guidelines advancing at the same time we're trying to figure this out. So I do think you still see some law enforcement agencies that are still playing catch up and don't necessarily understand these risks. And I've talked to others that are extremely progressive that are training all their guys not to maintain individuals in the prone position. They're training them how to get them up safely so they don't cause shoulder injuries. And I think we're all trying to figure this out collectively so that we reduce the risk of these deaths. I also want to say that you're talking about how many times have you been involved in one of these situations, and you look back and say, we were lucky. I actually have talked to a fair number of paramedics who've shared near misses with me. And by near misses, I mean situations where people were restrained, got chemical sedation, became apneic, but fortunately the providers picked it up quickly enough, resuscitated the patient, typically with a bag valve mask and oxygen, and the patient turned out just fine. But you can always hear in their voices that little bit of "there, but for the grace of God, go I" sound that tells me that beyond the deaths that we can catalog, there's a whole ton of near misses out there where we've come too close to the razor's edge.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
Where is Dan? You've been doing this 30 plus years. One of the things I'm thinking about is this has been going on for quite a long time, but the rise in camera phones and recordings have helped, and police officer worn body cameras has helped hold people accountable.
Yeah.
And for us to catch these things, because maybe we didn't even really know that this was as harmful or as detrimental as it was.
Right.
But yeah, where does your brain go with all that and what you've seen in 30 years on?
Well, I mean, having all those other resources, it's immediately after when you start out of that fire rig, you know you're on camera, and so you automatically tone it down. So the last few years, everything's been a lot easier on the police side and on our side, and with all the spotlight on the George Floyds and so on and so forth. It's really it's in everyone's mind on every call we go on.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that's incredibly important, by the way. As an attorney, one of the things I share with providers is your assumption must be that you're always on camera, whether it's a body cam, a ring cam, or a cell phone. And I agree with Dan's assessment. It's changed the way these are carried out. You mentioned accountability. I think that's something else I'd like to touch on.
Yeah.
I think often in these cases, we see a focus on individual accountability. You know, are these guys going to have license suspension? Are they subject to civil liability? In some cases, criminal liability, which is pretty frightening,
Right.
I think, both for providers and I get a lot of calls from chiefs saying that this is keeping them up at night. I often find what concerns me is often there's a lack of focus on system accountability, right? Asking the question of, because what training do these guys have? What were their protocols? Were they adequately warned about the risks associated with prone restraint and chemical sedation? And the answer I have, having looked hard at a bunch of these, is that this is where the concept comes from, that we need to reframe how we approach these, because it's unfair to ask providers themselves to understand these risks if the leadership of our organizations, if the protocols we're rolling out for these guys, and if the training doesn't alert them to these risks, then it seems to me grossly unfair to focus so much on individual accountability. So I agree that cameras have led to greater accountability. My hope is that that accountability really leads to systemic change that keeps patients safer and keeps providers out of the harm's way when it comes to risk of liability.
Yeah, very well said. I'm thinking back now to the training I had on RSI was pretty substantial, and I feel like our department really trained pretty heavily on how to do it properly to protocol. One of the things that we always had issues with, and I'm laughing at Dan because Dan also works for a local flight program, or I'm sorry, used to. Yeah. And that flight program hired a bunch of medics at my department. And those medics were notorious for having their charts pulled for QA purposes because they would RSI per flight protocols, not local fire protocols. And it would be like, where did they come up with this plan? You know, that's not protocol. But it was always such a shocker to see some of the drugs they pushed, but they were going off of another protocol set. And so
sure,
there's a lot of nuance in the way that, you know, the sequence of events are department to department. I feel like it varies pretty heavily. The drugs chosen, the amounts, the dose, you know, the everything else. And then I'm also thinking about, you know, the number of innovations that students get on their internships. I mean, I would say my average intern got less than 5.
Really?
Probably 2 to 3 would be average. And they were 90% of those, and that's just my back of the napkin guess, but probably 90% of those were from cardiac arrest, not RSIs.
Not RSI.
We would practice in the station a bunch with mannequins and med math and everything else, but it was almost never an RSI that we were having them, you know, learn in the field on. And so my brain's going back to all these ways that Eric just brought up, this extra training that's required in New Hampshire, and wondering if it shouldn't be something similar on some level to everywhere.
So I went to in-service in 1997, and I happened to sit in the front row. And after the in-service was over, they said, okay, the first 2 rows, I need you guys to stay here. Hour-long in-service on RSI. We were RSI paramedics.
Just because you were in the first 2 rows.
Front row.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
But I do want to touch on, I think the analogy here is an apt one, right? You mentioned that RSI paramedics, even in the best case, don't get a ton of actual live RSI innovations, and probably most of us are what we'd call occasional intubators.
Right.
And so it's almost the definition, right, of a halo event, high acuity, low occurrence. I think that analogy, again, is extremely apt for chemical sedation. We're showing up at a scene where often there are emotions racing high. Perhaps the police have been involved in a confrontation with this individual. The individual, perhaps through no fault of their own, has injured one of the police officers. In some cases, there's been physical altercations, tasing, and emotions are running high. We have a relatively junior paramedic perhaps step into this scenario. He's being told by police that the individual needs to be sedated and needs to happen now. And all of that emotion and pressure on that junior paramedic interfere with the capacity to, stop and be thoughtful about how they're going to approach this situation. And I think it's one of the things that needs to be reframed, just as I think in many cases we've reframed our approach to RSI to make it a more deliberate as opposed to precipitous process and enhance safety along the way by doing that. We need to do the same thing with chemical sedation. If you're a paramedic walking into this highly charged scene, you need to take a beat. It's maybe an emergency, and it may even be a medical emergency, but we need to recognize that if we approach it precipitously, we're just increasing the danger. And our first obligation is not to increase the danger, but instead bring calm and focus to what's happening.
Totally. If you were to walk into a scene or ones you have, and you've got a patient who's prone, on the sidewalk or wherever in the street, in a house, how are you approaching that conversation with the police officer about getting the patient up on their side?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The way I'm going to approach it is, hey, Joe, can we turn him up on his side? No, he's staying right where I got him, might be the response. Hey, I'm worried about his breathing. We really need to get him up. So I'm going to be persistent, but I'm going to be professional, and I'm trying to send the police officers signals that I'm worried about the patient's ability to breathe, hopefully to reach through some of that emotion and let him realize that keeping the individual in that position creates risk both for the patient and for him as a provider. I think, though, part of the answer varies on a local level. So I think one of the things that we need to see happen is we need to see police chiefs sit down with EMS chiefs in their local regions and talk about how they would collectively manage these calls so that we have some agreement that if I show up as a paramedic and I'm trying to intervene, I'm not trying to interfere with their ability to do their job or tell them how to do their job. My job when I show up is to help keep everybody safe. And I think some of that requires having had conversations beforehand. I also think one of the things I advocate is that when we reframe our approach, we shouldn't just do classroom training. This also does require simulation, literally setting up simulation sessions where you have someone acting as the agitated patient, someone acting as a police officer, someone acting as the paramedic team who's coming in and trying to manage through these situations to game ahead of time how you would have these conversations and then how you would actually go about performing the chemical sedation.
Let's talk next about the chemical sedation process and how maybe some ways we need to reframe our thoughts there. I know that we've had other people on this show that we've talked about chemical sedation with for a variety of purposes. I can think back to a 2-part episode we did on ketamine and one more local paramedic's experience with that personally with his daughter in an ER room, and then also giving it as a paramedic in the field for patients. But what are your thoughts on chemical sedation, and what learning points do you have for listeners when it comes to that procedure?
Yeah, sure. First, let me start off by saying that I actually am a strong supporter of the use of chemical sedation in appropriate circumstances, but it's dependent upon ensuring that the EMS providers who are performing the chemical sedation have been adequately trained in how to use it safely. So what do I mean by that? We show up on scene sometimes after the police have been wrestling with somebody, and we show up and they say, hey, you got to sedate this guy. And we're looking at the guy, and he's sitting on the pavement with his hands cupped behind his back. He may have been agitated 5 minutes ago, but at this point in time, he's no longer agitated. I think at that point, there is no indication for chemical sedation. And I bring this up because in a lot of the videos I've watched and cases I've helped review, that's exactly what happens. The paramedic comes in, the patient was agitated perhaps before they arrived, but now they've calmed down. We're not giving chemical sedation prophylactically, right? It's
Right.
only when we arrive on scene, the patient is actively a threat to themselves or others. My next big point would be that when we approach chemical sedation, we need to do it carefully, deliberately, and not precipitously. What do I mean by that? In a lot of the videos we see the police wrestling with someone, EMS shows up on scene, the EMS provider draws up some ketamine, goes over to where the patient's being held prone on the ground, injects the ketamine and you watch this unfold on camera, and you're wondering to yourself, where's the assessment that we do before we engage in significant treatments? Where's the monitor? If you can't get vital signs on someone who's agitated right at the moment, we need to have the monitor available in case so that we can get vital signs after he's sedated. And if we need to resuscitate this individual, where's our resuscitation equipment? So what I advocate for providers is when you show up at one of these scenes and someone's severely agitated, for sure that might very well be a medical emergency. And for sure it might be perfectly appropriate to proceed with chemical sedation, but you need to take a beat. You need to take at least a few moments to adequately both assess the situation, assess your patient, and make sure that you're prepared. Because in many cases, chemical sedation works extremely well. You sedate the patient, he calms down, you put him over on the stretcher, you take him up to the hospital. But as we now know from cases around the country, sometimes things do go awry, and it's incumbent on us, if we're going to use chemical sedation, to both anticipate and prepare for those untoward consequences that might occur, including, for example, apnea.
The fire department I'm involved with, we've had a number of events where it just feels like it tends to happen to very junior paramedics, and maybe there's a power dynamic there with more seasoned officers seeing brand new medics get off the ambulance. I'm not sure. But it's usually our 2-person medics that go out, and the department's a combination department, 3-person engine, 2-person medic. And the medics have told a number of stories over the last, I would say probably 2 or 3 years, I can remember, where police officer approaches them, they've got someone in custody, and they're nearly demanding chemical restraint. And as a police officer, I just got to imagine that's not a smart thing to be, asking of or demanding from a paramedic. Are you aware of anywhere that allows that, Eric?
No, just the opposite. I think in a lot of these cases, we've seen police demanding chemical sedation. And I think the only appropriate response to that is to say, I'm sorry, I need to assess the patient. I can't administer chemical sedation on the direction of law enforcement. That's specifically prohibited by my training and protocols. I'm going to do an assessment, and if I think sedation is indicated, I'm prepared to proceed with it, but not at the direction of law enforcement. I think we need to cut our police colleagues a little bit of slack. If this is a patient that we've all gone for before, and we've had to sedate them before to gain control, if I walk into a scene that we've both been to before and the police officer says, hey, Eric, this is Steve, he's at it again, I think you're going to need to sedate him, I don't have an issue with that. He's not so much directing sedation as indicating to me that he's agitated again, but I'm still going to walk in and do my own assessment to determine whether chemical sedation is indicated. This is exactly the way I operate actually as an RSI paramedic. I get called all the time by other paramedics for individuals, maybe it's a traumatic brain injury, maybe it's an overdose, where they think the patient needs to be RSI'd. I'll meet them on the side of the road and hop in the back of the ambulance. Most of the time, they're right. They've called me and they've assessed the situation correctly, and we proceed on to RSI. Sometimes I get there and I find we can manage the airway successfully without needing to proceed on to RSI. And that's a call that I need to make when I show up on scene.
Hey, do you find that, so if you come into either one of those scenes, whether it's chemical sedation or RSI, and let's say the police are amped up or your fellow paramedics are amped up, you come in with that calm demeanor, that in itself is part of the treatment where you're calm, you start bringing everyone else down a little bit. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And you mentioned a little bit ago that It seems as though these are often situations involving junior paramedics. That's exactly what I worry about, quite honestly. I think, as we know, we have a staffing issue in EMS, and so we're recruiting more new people than ever, more new gold patches being minted. And with the retirement of so many seasoned folks, we're actually seeing fewer mentors able to help ensure that they're adequately trained. I am very concerned that we're putting these junior paramedics out there in situations that they're not completely equipped to handle. And I think, yes, you're right. One of the things we bring as senior paramedics to those scenes is a sense of calm, right? Where we're going to walk in and say, hey, what's going on? You've got some agitated guy who's handcuffed to the chair. He is jacked up on something, alcohol, stimulant drugs. He legitimately looks like he's going to rip his shoulders out of the sockets, and he's saying he wants to kill all of us. The police are looking at us saying we have to sedate this guy now, get him under control. We still need to take a beat. Hey, what's going on? This guy's out of control. Hey, have we made efforts to de-escalate him? Don't even bother. There's no point to doing that. I've actually had quite a few senior paramedics say to me, Eric, even in situations where everybody else thought this guy couldn't be de-escalated, I've been able to take him aside, get him in the back of the ambulance, connect with him, get things calmed down to the point where we concluded we didn't actually need to chemically sedate him. Okay, we've now decided together that we are going to pursue the chemical sedation. Steve, do you agree? Dan, do you agree? We've exhausted all of our other options. We're going to have to proceed with chemical sedation. Yeah. Steve agrees. Dan agrees, right? All right, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to give this guy some ketamine. I think that's the right drug to use here. We could use droperidol, but I think we need to gain control of the situation quicker. I think the droperidol will take too long. Do we all agree? Yes, we all agree. Here's what we're going to do. I think I'm going to give him the ketamine. I think he's going to calm right down. We'll move him over to the stretcher. It'll go smoothly. But I don't know what this guy's on. He's consumed quite a bit of alcohol. He's on some kind of stimulant drugs, we're being told. We've got no way to verify that. So there is some risk things could go poorly. There is some risk he could become apneic after he gets the ketamine. Here's how we're going to manage it. Steve, can you go back to the truck and get all the monitoring stuff? I want you to get everything, including pulse ox, make sure we have end-tidal CO2. I know we can't get it on him right now, but I want you to sit right next to this guy. And as I give him the ketamine, I want you paying attention to his airway and breathing. And the moment he calms down, you get all the monitoring stuff on. Dan, can you go back to the truck? I want you to get all of our recess stuff. Get O2, get BVM, non-rebreather, get our intubation stuff. I don't think we're going to need it, but if Steve, when he's monitoring this guy, should alert us to the fact that he's gone apneic, or he looks like he's getting tired, or he looks like his breathing's slowing down, we might need to step in and begin to bag valve mass ventilate him. While we're having this conversation, someone else comes over and says one of the police officers has been hurt. Can I have Steve come over here and take a look at him? Hey, I'm really sorry. I need both of these guys here for the chemical sedation we're about to do. Okay. That's how I think you set up a chemical sedation, so that even in emergent circumstances, even when you need to, quote unquote, get it done, you get it done as safely as you possibly can.
Yeah, I know that one of the things, and I'm just thinking through how I've set up scenes before and how I could improve that. But one of the things that I know I've always been leery of, and I can think of a quick solution to this, but I've always been leery of bringing in a bunch of gear that could potentially be used, throwing things, hitting things, swinging stuff around. We've had I can think of a couple patients where they were literally pulling cabinets off the walls and like breaking everything that they could touch.
In the house?
In the house, yeah. And, the way that we organize that is we stage all of our equipment so it's very close by, that if and when we need it, we can then grab it. Because the person with that needle is they're in a tight spot.
Yeah.
They've got the pokey thing.
Yeah.
And they don't want to get poked themselves.
Right.
And it can be a hairy situation for sure. But I like the way we've talked about organizing scenes better with this material in a lot of ways that we've talked about organizing scenes better in a variety of ways on this podcast. And chemical sedation should be right at the top of that list of scenes that you need to, get all your stuff out and have it ready to roll if and when, things take a turn. But we talk about, like, cardiac arrest. We talk about organizing the scene all the time for that.
Right.
And organizing your scene more appropriately for chemical sedation is something that we need to
Absolutely
be talking about a lot more. But yeah, you're making me think a lot, Eric. I like
yeah,
that.
I know. Me too.
So I think you guys have identified another key aspect, right? These are protocols in my mind are guidelines. They're not prescriptive rules. We're not operating in a nice, clean, well-lit ED with as much help as we can possibly need. We're operating at 3 a.m. in the kitchen space where there's a 20-watt light bulb. They've smashed out all the rest of the lighting. We're inadequately resourced because everybody else is off at a fire that's going on at the same time. And guidelines need to be adaptable to the situation. If it's truly an out-of-control situation, there may be times when you need to act, I hate the word precipitously, but rapidly, and have your gear staged right outside. But I have to tell you, I've watched a lot of videos where paramedics have administered chemical sedation. I have really yet to see one that was so emergent where they couldn't take a couple of minutes to set things up in advance to make sure things went smoothly. And if I'm watching the video, it's because someone died, potentially in part as a consequence of the chemical sedation. So I agree. What we're creating is guidelines, and we're trying to train people to be able to adapt to the particular situation. But if we create the guideline that says this is how it ideally goes, and almost more importantly, these are the risks that we need to be aware of, then you can adapt those guidelines in real time to make them work for the particular situation you're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you, at your agency, is ketamine your go-to, or do you go like Versed and Anapsine at all?
Yeah, we have brand new restraint protocols here in New Hampshire that just came out about a month ago that I helped write. Historically, we had sort of at the lower end Versed and Haldol, and at the higher end ketamine. We've now added droperidol, what we think of as sort of as an intermediate agent. I don't have any experience using droperidol for severe agitation in the field, but I've talked with a medical director at a large EMS agency down in Texas that has been using droperidol for some period of time, and they like it. They think it's for those non-truly emergent cases, it's a great sort of go-to choice. When I asked for paramedics who didn't like droperidol, what was their concern? It takes a while. It takes 15 to 20 minutes to fully kick in. So in my mind, the way it operates is midazolam / Versed at kind of the lower end. You've got a demented grandmother who's a little out of control, who needs to go to the hospital and may need just a whiff of midazolam. Sort of the moderate end, someone who is agitated and needs to get something, but it's not, he's not an immediate risk to themselves or others. He's not thrashing around violently. That's droperidol. And at the higher end, ketamine is really for that out of control individual who you really do need to gain rapid control of the scene, albeit again, not precipitously.
So for our protocols, that would be call-in drug for ketamine. You know, we do Versed and Anapsine as our first out for that type. What would, if I called in, what is the dosage, the appropriate dosage for your average size person?
So you see a range of dosages talked about. Here in New Hampshire, we use 4 mg per kg, rounded up to the nearest 50, just to make it easier for folks to calculate. I actually think while in some of the deaths, we've seen a big focus on the ketamine dosage and was there an overdose of ketamine, we actually have pretty good studies that tell us you can't really overdose anybody on ketamine. There's no toxic dose of ketamine. There was a study done with accidental overdoses of children in hospital for procedural sedation. They got between 2 and 50 times the recommended dose of ketamine, and there were no adverse consequences for any of those children. None of them died. So the traditional teaching is with ketamine, you want to, if you're going to disassociate them, you want to make sure they're fully disassociated. If you had an IV in place, which we almost never do for these agitated folks, 2 milligrams per kilogram is probably a good dose. That's what I use in the RSI context to achieve dissociation. With intramuscular dosing, it's typically 4 to 5 milligrams per kilogram.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Good to know. Thank you.
I also have to say, I am not a big fan of the need for online medical control for these situations. I actually, here in New Hampshire, we have very few things that require online medical control. I'm sympathetic to systems that have said, look, we want to have an online medical control call before you use ketamine or before you use any chemical sedation in some cases. Probably not so much because I think we need Mother May I, but rather it requires the paramedic to take a beat and organize his thoughts and articulate to someone else why he's proceeding with chemical sedation and perhaps what his plan is. Personally, I wouldn't have that work through online medical control. I'd rather train the paramedic to be able to do that on their own or with another paramedic or with a on-scene supervisor. But I respect the decision some jurisdictions have made to keep it as online medical control.
Yes, it is a little frustrating.
Eric, I want to kind of pivot. You know, we've talked about the various components of chemical sedation, and we've hinted at, you know, some of the bigger cases that have happened in the last few years with, you know, I think it's safe to say the one that kind of kicked things off, so to speak, was George Floyd's death. And then most recently in Colorado with the death of Elijah McClain. I'm thinking about all the components of things we've talked about. And then I'm looking back over the arguments that were made, especially in the Elijah McClain case. I think one of the biggest ones that I remember reading about was people were saying, are we going to hold paramedics responsible now for outcomes that are beyond their control? And I remember hearing that, and I didn't personally think that argument jived with some of the body cam footage.
Right.
But I also didn't think there was necessarily direct malice in that case. But what I would love to get your take on that and kind of what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. First off, let me say Elijah McClain's death was incredibly tragic for him, for his family, for everyone involved. I think the criminal charges and conviction of the paramedics surprised and shocked a lot of people. And I think, as you said, what was different here, you know, we unfortunately occasionally do see paramedics who end up with criminal charges, typically for something where there was criminal intent on their part, where they knew they were acting inappropriately. I don't think anybody has alleged that these guys intended to hurt Elijah McClain. And so I think in that context, a lot of people were shocked that essentially negligence, because that's what was alleged here, that they were grossly or criminally negligent, and that led to Elijah McClain's death, that could result in criminal liability, going to jail when there was no actual intent to cause harm. And it's actually not unique to Colorado's laws. The laws of many states actually do permit criminal charges in circumstances that we would call grossly negligent or criminally negligent.
There were a lot of surprising components to that case for me. It was interesting to me that the lead paramedic was given 5 years. And I would love to know what the thought process was behind that. The other side of things the fact that here we had a kid who was, I believe he was autistic. Is that correct?
So I don't know if he had a formal diagnosis of autism, but it's assumed that he was likely on the autism spectrum. Clearly had some disabilities along that line.
Yeah, and so that brings in, you know, a whole nother side of things for the argument. Like, are we considering maybe that's what we're seeing here is some of the maybe oddities or differences in behavior is what we're seeing with a patient that's not necessarily, like you said, excited delirium or agitation or something beyond just this is how they might normally act on some level.
Right.
Yeah, there were so many. I don't know that I've ever been more conflicted on a case than that, because honestly, you don't want to see any of your paramedic colleagues go to prison, and at the same time, you want all of them held to a high standard, and when they don't live up to that, it makes you think, okay, well, there's got to be some repercussions for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the conversation that's happening in EMS, right? And has caused, I think, as tragic as all of the circumstances were of that case, it's actually fostered a fair amount of conversation about both what are the right approaches to physical and chemical restraint, and do we need to reframe them, and about accountability. And I think when I talk about these cases, I always say, look, it's not for me to judge the actions of the individuals involved. I wasn't their training officer. I didn't write their protocols. I don't know what leadership in their organization has been doing to help ensure they're adequately trained. Really, when I look at these tragic incidents, for me, it's a forward-looking focus. Hey, let's look hard at these incidents. Let's not be afraid to look away so we can figure out how to change things so that we reduce the risk of this happening going forward. I also have for me, the accountability piece, I completely get it. If people have acted in a grossly negligent way, there likely should be some accountability. And yet, for me, a big part of the focus, the question I want to hear the answer to is, great to focus on individual accountability. Where's the system accountability?
Yeah. Right.
Because you need to look at an understanding of how the system was operating, their protocols, their training, their leadership, because that's where some of the responsibility may actually lie, and not at the individual paramedic level. For sure, I'm not suggesting in any way that people who act outside their protocols or grossly negligent shouldn't be held accountable, but we need to be asking that larger question, which hopefully then turns into, as I said, how do we bring more focus to this at the leadership level, and what do we need to change? And interestingly, when I talk about radically reframing our approach, part of that, quite honestly, is I think some people have said, well, you know what, chemical sedation, it's fine. We just need to tweak it a little bit. We just need to tell people, hey, it's really important that you monitor patients after they've been sedated. I hate that approach, I'll be quite honest with you, because number one, I don't think we should be tweaking it. I think the concept of radically reframing asks us to step back and rethink our entire approach to chemical sedation, which is what I think is needed here. And at a technical level, monitoring after the fact, almost all of these cases that I look at, in fact, in one of them, you see the ketamine administered, you see the patient immediately put up on the stretcher, and you can hear the EMT say, I'm going to get him on the end tidal as soon as I get him in the back of the ambulance. And he's dead even before they arrive at the ambulance. Yeah. So part of my approach is, no, if I'm RSIing a patient, before I even proceed, I want to make sure he's hooked up to all the monitoring stuff, right? And if I can't hook him up because he's moving around too much, then I'm still paying very careful attention to his airway and breathing, and I'm prepared to put it on him the moment he calms down. And once I place a tube into his trachea, my focus is 100%. I'm sitting with the patient's head between my legs. I'm watching him breathe. I'm looking over at the monitor and watching my capnography waveform. I'm telling the EMT who's sitting in that seat to obsessively press the blood pressure button, right? I own that patient and his airway and breathing at that point. Chemical sedation needs to be thought of the same way. Yeah. And so I'm glad that we're looking at this as a profession. I do worry that some of the fixes that are being implemented are only getting us halfway there. And I say this because Elijah McClain died in 2019. I have cases that I'm looking at from 2023 and 2024 where people died in very similar circumstances. In some of those cases, I can actually see that the police officers and or the EMS providers have had training. You see them say, for example, just don't let them go prone, don't let them go face down. Where did that come from? That came from George Floyd and Elijah McClain, and yet I'm watching that video because the patient involved died. And because while part of a solution was implemented, it wasn't a comprehensive enough rethink of how we approach the situation.
Eric, I know that you're a part of an organization called the True North Group. Can you help people give kind of a plug for what that is and how they could potentially get a hold of you if they wanted to have you do some training for them?
Yeah, sure. I'm an EMS educator. True North Group is just the business name for the under which I do EMS education. I do it both locally here in New Hampshire as well as across the country, focused around this death in custody stuff. I'm thrilled to have you guys have my email address in the show notes, if that makes sense. Jaeger at truenorthgroup.org. And just to be clear, while this is a business for me, I am interested in seeing this issue addressed. I make all of my materials available to anybody who wants to do training on this topic. the PowerPoint presentations, links to all the videos, bibliography of the scientific literature, and at absolutely no cost. If someone wants to have me come out and do training, I'm going out to Cleveland Clinic in August to do some training with them. I'm going down to Texas a little bit later in the year to do some training down there, and I'm thrilled to help. But whatever works most effectively for your organization to begin to address this issue is what I'm interested in supporting.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I just want to thank you for your time today and just being on the show and listening to our questions and continuing to get the word out about how we can completely reframe our thinking about chemical sedation and the various components involved with it.
Well, Dan, Steve, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. Let me close by saying, because I really actually, sometimes people say, hey, Eric, you're an expert on these issues. I actually don't like that word. What I like to say is that this is a conversation we're all having to collectively figure out a better way forward. So I'm thrilled when you guys say your wheels are turning. I mean, if you come up with a better mousetrap, for sure, I want to hear about that as well. Yeah. I think the goal here is to do the best we can to keep patients safe and to keep EMS providers and our law enforcement colleagues out of the risk of liability. And the nice thing for me is those are closely aligned if we do a better job with how we approach this situation. So I thoroughly appreciate the opportunity to come and on the podcast and talk with you guys.
Yeah, 100%, man. Appreciate you. All right. Well, we will leave it there, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks so much.